I've been looking at poetry. So I have a lot of respect for people here and their appreciation of poetry and language. So I want to, if it's okay, I want to do a discussion on poetry and language and poetic language. Your discoveries, especially, both from the perspective of the producer and the consumer, but more from the perspective of the producer. Some of you, like Paul, DLJ, Anton, have been writing poetry. So could you share your experience of kind of writing poetry, what it feels like, what kind of progress you make, what kind of challenges you face? Just like an open-ended question on poetry, not from the perspective of a consumer, but from the from the perspective of a producer. So if you would be generous enough to share with us whatever your thoughts are, whatever your experiences are, really appreciate that. If you'd like to do that, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Right. Let's start with DLJ.
I'm sure I've got anything to say. I just thought there might be silence otherwise. First thought that came into my head, it's genetic. My father wrote poetry, although I didn't know that until I was, I was already writing myself. We found some of his RAF logbooks that had poetry in them. My son writing poetry, who didn't know I wrote poetry, despite the fact I've been published in 3 countries, he didn't know that. It's like, how did you not know that? But he's, yeah. So there's something genetic somewhere in the to do with the love of words, I suppose, and the flow of words and the pattern of words and so on. For me, originally, I think it was just catharsis, just getting something out, and it seemed to have a kind of rhythm to it. So it was like, oh, okay. And then later on, when I stopped for a long time. My marriage had something to do with that, I think. And then sort of rediscovered it later when I moved to Australia, because I found a colleague, also a writer, and we became writing partners, and I think improved each other by gentle criticism and saying, well, why don't you add, or what do you think about adding a sort of place, time, event here, as opposed to, anyway, so I think we sort of honed our skills a bit. And then since then, I tend to write to order. So if somebody's got some sort of emotional thing going on in their lives, and somebody, they tell me something, and I say, well, I think there's a poem in that. Do you mind if I do something for you? And then I write something, and they go, wow. If I can bring a tear to somebody's eye, if I can make somebody miserable, then I know I've achieved something good. That's not what I meant. And I wrote a couple, obviously, for my parents' funerals, quite long ones. I was commissioned effectively to write those. So I kind of write to order now, or this session, really. I don't really write other than that. If somebody says, I don't know, there's a theme or something, I go, oh, okay, I'll see what it comes out. And 30 minutes later, there's either something good or not, right? So I tend to go for the flow kind of poem, which is like, if it works, great. And I tend not anymore to do that really hard work, right? When you've got a good, you've got a good idea, and you sit down and you're bashing it away, and then you realize it's maybe not. Yeah, so I don't bother with those anymore. So I just go with the ones that are more instinctive. And I don't need a writing partner. I think I've mentioned this a few times before. I don't really need a writing partner now, because he's in my head. Right, I've already got that. And so if I write something and I go, no, okay, Harold will criticize that bit. Why? Because it's clunky, or it doesn't flow, or because because it's nice to have a callback to something earlier in a poem, right? Like a good comedy sketch. So if I miss something like that, I know he's going to critique it, so I don't actually need to submit anything to him anymore. So that's kind of it now. My personal experience.
I have a couple of, I want to do this as a conversation, because I want to make sure that I understand what you're saying, what everybody's saying. And I want to throw spotlight on some of the things that I thought was great about what was said. So one was the point about love of words. So I would love to hear more about that. The second one is you talked many, many times about the writing partner, and then the value of that. And I have to say, I don't write poetry, but I do a lot of writing, and most of the writing I do with my business partner, and it works beautifully because what happens is that it's two people who trust each other, who know each other very well, but have very different styles and different strengths and different weaknesses, and just going back and forth and letting, observing something that you did not notice before. I think that is huge.
Great.
I'm really fascinated with this, writing a poem in response to an emotion or a situation. That's also kind of like a conversation, right? You're basically trying to capture something that somebody else is giving you, and then you're putting it in words, and then you hear, you see their response. It's like, okay, this is, and many times people don't have the gift of the gab to be able to do it, to be able to say, to be able to kind of express in words what a person is feeling. And if you have that craft of the, if you have your way with the words, then you are able to do that. And that's a very significant value. And for a person doing this in words, it's a tremendous value to see to what extent you have managed to actually capture it, because you can see it in their face and you can see it in their reaction. So I thought that was really, so those are the three things that really stood out. So would you like to talk a little bit about the love of words, and anything you want to say about writing partners, and this, what kind of conversation goes on when you're trying to do a poem for a particular person?
Yeah, okay, I made notes. Got all three down. Right, so the love of words bit. So recently I got diagnosed as aphantasiac. For decades I thought that when people said they have a mind's eye, or when the art teacher said imagine something and then draw it, and I couldn't, I thought that was just a kind of metaphor, until somebody recently said, no, that's actually a thing. If you can't you don't have visual images, right? So I've got memories, but I can't, if you said imagine something that I hadn't seen before, I can't, there's nothing there, isn't it? Yeah. So I think to use a Jungian term, I think it's overcompensation. So I think the words part must be, because I have words in my head, right? But I don't have visual images. So I think there must be a sort of overcompensation bit there going on. There you go, some self-diagnosis. I don't know whether that true that is. Music doesn't do it for me too much, but lyrics do. So I guess I've just got a preference for the word side of things, right? Some music does. On the partner side, the bit I didn't mention, I think I had mentioned in previous sessions, but I might as well say it again. There's it is quite painful. It's I think, like even last week, Maritza saying, when you put a poem out there and somebody else critiques it, you have that, oh, it's my baby, you can't, that getting over that is not easy. It takes, even still, actually, just giving somebody else and saying, go on, take that apart. You have to kind of bite your lip and hold your tongue a bit and just go, oh yeah, thanks very much. And you go, no, I love that part, you can't change it. So that's a discipline thing. But you get used to it a little bit. You get used to that bit. On the conversation side, it's not quite a conversation. It's usually when somebody says something to me and that just triggers something for me. Or they've written something where there's a really strong idea in there, but they've written it in a way you just think, oh, that could be so much better. And you just sort of go, well, do you mind if I have a go at that? Somebody wrote a beautiful piece on essentially they were having doubts about something. I was saying, oh, you've got some real, do you mind if I turn that into something? And I sent it back and they recognized their own words, but I'd done it in a way they just went, wow, I couldn't have written that. And I just think, okay, good. So I get a kind of smug, terrible, isn't it? A smug feeling of, oh, no, I did that. But no, you feel like you've given something, like some sort of, I don't know, contributed to their something or other. It's not really a conversation though. It's kind of, they give something and I hone it, tune it, give it back, and then if they like it, great. But that's it. It's not. It ends after that.
Got it. No, I've noticed that your ability to edit is incredibly good. I think you're a better editor than a writer. I mean, that's just my take on it.
Ow.
No, sorry. No. What I mean is that, like, what you can do when you see like the entire poem written by all these people and say, you know what if I did this? What if we did this? Or what if we did that? And that just comes to you naturally. And for me, it's like, for me, writing is mostly editing. Most of it is editing. It's like editing to kind of make it look better and kind of make it more powerful. And while you're doing it, it's a very creative process.
So
It's
you're saying one is ex materia because you start with something, the other is ex nihilo. So
right.
I think
Right.
you're right. I might be better at the ex materia than the ex nihilo. So I'll grant you that.
Yeah. So I mean, the thing is that all of us have our strengths. Like, for example, like the visual, it's like difficult. It's difficult for me to imagine because I'm a very visual person. So for me, it is very difficult to imagine kind of operating just with words. And like, for me, the words are kind of hanging on this visual thing. There are all these metaphors going on, and the words are kind of explicating it. But the higher level kind of structures, they're always visual for me. So it's very interesting to kind of have this kind of conversation to see that. So thank you very much, DLJ. Next up is Anton, Paul, and Cam. Anton.
Yeah, there's certain things that I'm thinking about, and a couple of things I'm inspired to say that I wouldn't have thought to say about like either the writing process or writing, in my experience of writing a form of poetry. I, for a while now, maybe not always, but like, so when I say it hasn't been a like, I have time periods where I'm more consistent in writing for myself, and then other time periods where it's like it's the I haven't done this in a while, but it might be like very occasional. Fortunately, I've been more inspired recently, but there's a planned as well as spontaneous approach to the writing process. And what I mean by that is I often have some idea of what I want to start the verse with. But I purposely leave it open to what it's going to turn into. And usually it turns into 2 or 3 or more different things, whether they're connected or whether they're just things that appear in my mind. And I love having that spontaneity there, but I don't mind a certain degree of planning. I can't really imagine at least being comfortable with planning the whole verse out before I finish it. I almost feel, although it's something that's a crutch to this extent, like I have to rely on some degree of spontaneity to see what happens with the process. So this might be related to that, but just another note that I had is like the challenge that one of the challenges I experience with my writing process is what approach I will take. And there's certain conscious approaches, so I can focus more on the linguistic or words aspect of it. I could focus more on just, I think part of what you were describing, Shrikant, is like capturing the emotion, which is a different skill or a different focus for me. I can focus on the rhythmic aspect of it. Like, I've purposely differentiated these things. There's different words that you could use to describe each of these things, but I've differentiated these things in my mind because I've purposely written verses. This one is intentionally focused on rhythm. This one is intentionally focused on words. And it's nice to be able to mix all of them together. But I find that a couple more things, at least briefly, I'm fascinated with styles, style differences. I'm definitely influenced by like old school lyrical hip hop. Not limitly old school, but that's where some of my biggest inspiration is of writing, and the differences between the styles, even to the extent of nuances. I realize the word fascination may apply to that. I didn't really think about the last thing I'll say right now is you were describing, Shrikant, and also DLJ, of when you're writing about someone else's experience. But there is one memory that popped in my head. I forgot about this because this was at least 4 or 5 years ago, that I was going to collaborate with a person that I know. We were going to do a song together. She sings and plays guitar, and I was going to do a verse, but I was going to do a verse about what her life, like part of her life story. So I already know her. I think it helps that I know her well, but she was giving me details of the life story to write about. And I was surprised by how much fun, I didn't think it was going to be fun, that I had writing trying to like get her perspective. I say portray, but not in a pretentious way, just capture her perspective in the words, and she was impressed, and that felt great, you know, to share that with her, and she felt that way. So those are some
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Anton. I want to highlight 4 things that I found really interesting. One is this dance between planning and spontaneity, where you have to, and I always have difficulty with it. I'm more spontaneous, and I keep doing some amount of planning. I could do probably more planning, but I find that when you actually succeed in planning, it's like continuously going between order and chaos. So it's like keeping yourself free enough to notice different patterns, and then kind of figuring out exactly what the patterns was, and then using that as a spine to build more things. Because like kind of a planned thing, too much planning kind of makes it like stultified. It doesn't live enough. So you have to give enough planning. But if you don't do planning, it's just all over the place, and it doesn't really have any kind of structure, any kind of coherence about it. So giving the spine through enough for planning, and then hanging the rest of the body off that spine. And in the process, you actually go back and rework the spine to see how it flows. So it's a real, when that dance between the two. My friend Rob Trasinski did a presentation on writing. So this is a core idea that he has for writing, where you have to keep, you have to be good at switching between your analytical and creative faculties, so that, and both of them can't really work together at the same time in the same way. So you kind of have to keep shifting gears. And you can produce something wonderful by just changing, shifting gears and doing multiple passes with one and then the other one and the other, like that. So that, I thought that was really interesting. Second, I really like your point about approach, what approach you take, because poetry is a living thing, and it has so many different aspects, and there are so many different angles you can come at it. It's like Leonardo has this concept of excellences upon excellences, that you can actually keep on building things into it. It's like you say, okay, I got this, now I'm going to get this. And you do that while keeping that first excellence in it. And you integrate and kind of achieve this new thing, like you might have gotten the theme really, really well. And then you say, okay, but it's not visceral yet. So how do I make it visceral? You can say, okay, I have the basic thought, the sound is not right. So what can I do? And you keep on, and each of these layers, like multiple perspectives being brought to bear on the same thing, can be wonderful. The next point you made was about style. And I am really fascinated with style, because most people think of style as an afterthought of something that you put, you do the main substance and then you put a style on it. No. Actually, style is something far more fundamental. Actually, this the style that produces the substance. It is the way your mind works. So when you're actually trying to see a style of a person, style of expression, you're seeing how their mind works, how their expression works, how does the flow go. So you're actually looking not at the content of their mind, but at the operation of their mind. How do they grasp things? How do they express things? So it's the how, it is the method, it is epistemology, it is like psychoepistemology. How do they make their mind work? And it is just incredibly, incredibly fascinating topic, because it is about consciousness, really. It is not about existence, it is about consciousness, and how different consciousnesses encounter and deal with reality. The last point you made was about the conversation about your, working with your friend. And I find such a thing very, very interesting, because like when two people are interacting at a deep level, when you're not just trying to talk words at each other, but you're trying to grasp the nuance and the flavor of what the person is saying, feeling, experiencing, because they have a different style, if you have enough common value, you can get a lot. And because you're encountering the style not just in a product, like you're doing when you are reading somebody else's poem, but you're doing that in action, in operation. And if you're actually interacting, and going back and forth, I think something spectacular can come out of that. So I'm a big fan of conversation, of actually, deeply engaging other people and collaboration, because it can really produce something. Because the thing is, we are amazingly complex creatures, and the potentials that we have are actually much larger than what we have mapped out, and definitely far more larger than what we have actualized. So there is just a lot of unknown. And interesting thing is that the other person, who also has this amazing potential, has mapped different things out and has actualized different things. So they're giving you a present just by interacting with you, of showing you some of the mappings that you have not noticed, and showing you some of the things in action that you have never experienced yourself. So those were my thoughts. Do you have any follow-up thoughts?
Yeah, just quickly. Wow, that last part that you were saying is especially inspiring. And it reminds me of the last part that you're saying about the deeper connection. I mean, that part that you can form when interacting with somebody, but also the because I don't, at least like in a literal way, think about it this way, that they have their map, they have their way of approaching it, I guess could be one word. And when you're connecting with them, you're kind of finding that or sensing that. It reminds me of I've received feedback on like with one thing that I shared with one person told me that well, if you could use the timing as your advantage of it. Like I slipped up on the timing. I made a mistake a couple of times. But interestingly, and this is a way of flipping that around, is you could see the mistake as, oh no, you could use that timing to your advantage. And I purposely incorporated that into my writing as a challenge that I enjoy. Or that's happened to me a couple of times recently, and it's once again it's to my surprise. Like I like to be open anyway, but to my surprise, it was fun. I didn't think it was going to be fun. I was like, wow, okay, so that's a great way of seeing it. And now I'm thinking too, another thing just quickly that I'll say about a part of what you were saying, Shrikant, is I what I've been doing for a while now when I write is I'll get, fortunately, I'm inspired enough that I'll get most of it out the first time, usually. And then I might add some at the end, but I'll go back over it like more than once, usually. And I realize now in that process of going back over it, because we were talking about the analytical versus the, well, there more than one other way in which you could think about the approach. I could go back over it thinking of different approaches, because I kind of bounce back and forth between them anyway. Like you said, I was realizing as I'm writing, but I could also say, okay, let's go back over this from an analytical approach, or let's go back over this from what did I want to capture, emotion, spirit, whatever wise. Yeah, so I'm not sure if that was winded, but those are some thoughts that I have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anton. Next up is Paul.
That was great, both you guys. I learned a lot from that little start. I'm glad you're doing this tonight, Shrikant.
Thank you.
because sharing with people, trying to create what it feels like to create, somehow I love it. I don't know exactly why I love it, but I love it. And so I'll try to be concise. I actually had to take some notes. So in the last 24 hours, something came. So just in terms of process, I'm about to have some poems published, but I'm a little disappointed because I've learned that I really like the oral tradition. Like when I read my work, I can make it sound so much more than what is on that page. It's going to go in a book. So I'm actually like concerned, well, this doesn't work, this book thing. But that's one point about language and oral. So in the middle of the night, often, you know, the benefits of insomnia, you wake up and something comes to you. So what I do is I'm not going to play it for you, but I just keep my phone literally right by the bed, and then I hit record and I will just speak into it. And then when I wake up in the morning, I'll look at the result. And then it falls in two buckets. One is, well, that was a bunch of gibberish and I really thought it was genius. And the other is, no, maybe three. And the other is, it's like complete, like what you call the spine is there, the content is there. And the third, the hardest one is like somewhere in the middle. And then I have to think about what DLJ said, like, do I want to do the hard work to try to make this refine, or am I just going to throw it away and just only go with the ones that flowed right out? So this morning, it's great I have a concrete example of this because I thought, it's too bad this thing that was in my brain this morning, I said to myself, came to me on a Monday because it would be cool to read that to this group if it was like ready to read to the group. But that brings me to the point that I'm more conscious than I used to be about audience. So I guess I've changed, and a book that influences me all the time still, Shrikant, is The Master and His Emissary. I want to say a few things about what he said in there, but this movement in the trend over time for writing self-referentially and like for yourself, and you don't really give a damn who thinks what of it, versus like, oh, this is my audience, this is what is clarity for them, this is what language works for them. I'm more interested in that now. So if I wrote for this group, and I like writing for an audience, I would be able to talk about things that will fly with this group and use terms that would fly with this group. I'm not just talking about academic education. I'm talking about a vibe, a like way of thinking about what we're doing together and things like that. So the poem brings up a lot of points. I'll try to be quick and finish here, but
Paul, take your time. Take your time.
Okay,
Go ahead.
okay, but in that book, McGilchrist talks about art as a being, art as a living thing. That in his view, when the right brain is embracing in the way he likes to describe his ideal, it's interacting with the art like two people interacting. I mean, it's kind of a radical concept, but I love it. And I used to think with guitar solos, like in music, it sounded like an animal. Like a really great guitar solo sounds like an animal wailing from the stage, and you're listening and interacting with the animal. But anyway, I love that. But so anyway, I wrote a poem this morning about a poem that has a life, and it's something, and the whole spine occurred to me like the first time I tried to write a poem called, that's what I said, was like The Trail to Love or something. But I'll say a poem about love. The poem was hijacked by a philosopher king and driven to a remote island and interrogated and never let go. So that didn't work. So the second time I tried to write a poem about love, a Zen monk brutally murdered it and left it in a garden of koans. And the third time I write about love, a Dada artist confronted it and insulted it to death and then tore it to shreds and left it in a garden of abstraction, where it fed his abstractions. So, and then there was a poem that died one of those ways, and I asked it as it was dying to give me its dying words. And the poem said, don't try to write about love directly. Write about a garden in a winter storm waiting for spring. This all happened so there's the entire shape of it is all there. But see how verbose and messy, and it takes a long time to do the next phase on that. It's sort of in the third bucket in a way, but it has so much potential, but I can't analytically turn on my analytics and fix a poem like that. So what I found I do is, so who are the entities? Is it a Zen master? Is it a philosopher king? Is it a Dada artist? They could be different entities. The things where the poem dies could be different, and they need to be really concise and really clear. But for me, what happens next is my subconscious works on it. I do not sit and think about it. I do not Google metaphors. I do not look up terms. And sometimes in 3 days, the whole poem will come out again, much clearer. Sometimes not. That's the best I can do. And I hope it helped the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. So I want to highlight 5 points. First, you started talking about, this trepidation of saying, wait a minute, this living thing that I recite is now going to be captured in this book. How does that work? How does that work? That's a very profound thing, because what happens is that the oral communication has so much in it. Because when you are actually reciting a poem, or when you're just speaking, your character is visible to the person. Who you are is visible to the person. Your emotions are visible. You're moving your hands. Your gestures are visible. The variation of your tones, the volume of your sound, your movement, your entire body movement as connected with the meaning and the emotions, they are all providing this rich experience, which our brains are very, very good at taking in and decoding, because you are now providing actually so many different reference points from your network. I've talked about like communication as being, you have this amazing network of a brain, which is very dense, very complex, based on your experience, your thought, your approaches, everything. And the other person also has the same, and you're trying to communicate it through this line. Now, actually, oral communication is broadband, because you're not just giving the line, you're giving all of this, all of who you are with it. Now, for that to work in written form, a lot more things need to happen for that. So I think it is a genuine step of being able to do things in writing, and for writing to produce that kind of effect. And I am in awe of anybody who can do writing. And there are writings where you read it, and much more than what a person could say orally comes out from that writing. And it is an incredible, incredible thing. So I really love this point. I like your idea of recording, because that's what writing is for me. For example, I have thoughts and you write them down and you keep them away, and then you can go back to them. And it's very important to do what you're saying, okay, what is this? And because that's analytical, you're evaluating it. You're saying, is this something or is it nothing? I think there used to be a show Is this something or is it nothing? That's and then something, maybe something in the middle if you want. The next thing is about audience. Again, like, I do think that thinking of any kind of communication, any kind of writing as a conversation has tremendous potential, because what it does is that by even imagining an audience puts you in a different situation, because if you don't think of an audience, you're simply going by the line of your consciousness, which necessarily may not be objective to another person. But the moment you think of the audience, you have to say, how can I produce some kind of a routing in their network by what I say, so that they can grasp more of what I have to say? And you have to do that work of saying who the audience is. And you can internalize it like DLJ does. You can have, Walter in your head. And then what happens is that actually, even without the person being there, without the audience being present, you are able to imagine, because we can think of people at a far deeper level than we can think about anything else. Our brains are really, really good at dealing with people. That's how we evolved. So we are using all of that when we are trying to even imagine talking to another person, let alone actually talking. Your point about love, the most interesting thing I know about that is I've been reading these works of Lakoff, and there's a guy called Martin Turner who look at concepts of conceptual blending and of metaphors. And they're very, very deep ideas, and I'm just fully immersed in that. And the point, I think was Lakoff, or his co-author, I think Martin Johnson. The point he was making is that things like love are so deep and so complex that you can actually understand it only through a whole bunch of metaphors. So people think of, the metaphors that you generated were really unusual, outre, and that gives, but in order to, before talking about them, I want to talk about the metaphors that people use for thinking about love. They say love is a journey. They say, think of love as a partnership. Think of love as war. Think of love as a refuge. Think of love as nurturing. Think of love as excitement. Think of love as a challenge. And each of these actually produces different things in your mind. You see, the moment you hear it, it's like there is an explosion, little explosion, little explosion. And people hang what they think about love on some of these. So for somebody, it is a journey as a primary metaphor with a little bit of other things thrown in. Whereas for another person, refuge is the main thing. Now, if a person is talking about journey and this person is talking about refuge and they are actually in love, that conversation, they can't do much without understanding where those metaphors are coming from. So that's an example of metaphors being used in everyday language by everyday people. And then what poets do is that they bring in a metaphor that shakes you up. First, it produces what Owen Barfield calls the felt change of consciousness. Say, I'd not thought of it. And the beautiful thing is, like, when you say love is a rose, many aspects of rose, your mind automatically compares to. So is there a thorn? Is it temporary? Is it blooming now? Is it, so there's just so many things that that are brought up and connected. So this entire field is just beautiful of metaphors. The last point I want to acknowledge and really appreciate all the points that everybody's making here, is the role of subconscious. Many times what happens is that you do the work. And the great thing about subconscious is that it's not an alternative to doing the work. You do the work of creating all of those 4 or 5 things, and then you just keep it aside. And the subconscious will keep working on it. It'll work on it in its own time, and it'll keep producing new combinations. So being able to kind of respect the subconscious and work with it, and Rob, my friend, he puts it this, he says the problem is that many people actually don't understand either the conscious or the subconscious. So they ask their subconscious to do what their conscious does, and ask their conscious to do what the subconscious does. And they mix it all up. But keeping it kind of seeing that we have those capabilities, which are very different from each other, and respecting them enough is the starting point. So Paul, any thoughts, any further comments?
Yeah, thank you, Srikant. Yeah, a few, but when you, at the start of what you said, you talked about with the oral approach, you can express what you really, all about you. But I think that's a really important point. And like the one I read tonight by H.P. Lovecraft, and related to your points about love and different views, even though thankfully I don't have, at least at the depth he does, the devastation in H.P. Lovecraft's heart. It was so intense, the way he used metaphor to bring that devastation to us. So that is a key that I don't know if I said that I'm now looking for. I'm trying to, and I like to approach the awe of how much there is that we can't express, and my feeling of what that feels like, and express that feeling of what that feels like in poetry. So I'm trying to bring out those aspects. And a guy who helped me, I want to mention this because DLJ, you're from Australia, right? You live in Australia? No, where do you live?
Well, technically I live in Malaysia. I just happen to be in England at the moment.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, I thought you were in Australia. I don't know. It's your accent. It's something.
I was stranded there during COVID. But
okay, fine. But this guy, David Tennson, who's a writer who did this workshop that I was part of, he wrote a book called The Wrestle. It was the only thing that ever sold anything. That he explained it was because he got to an inner part of himself and showed it to the world with all that vulnerability. And that can't be replaced by anything. So your thoughts reinforce that in my mind, Srikant. And the goal of using language to do that, it's a very high and wonderful pursuit. So thank you for talking about it.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I mean, this approach, whether it is, you call it, and this point that you're making of saying you're trying to express the limits of yours being able to express things. That theme is there in Tao Te Ching, for example. Tao is full of that. You're trying to get to the Tao, but words are not enough. You're going to do words, but words don't capture the real Tao. You have these 10,000 things, kind of try to point a little bit better, but still not the same. Same thing with, Brahma, and same thing that's like, so this is a very deep idea in religious tradition. And religious tradition here is like, you're just looking at the deepest core of you and trying to figure it out as best as you can. So thank you. Next up is going to be Cam. Cam, go ahead.
Yeah, so many, so much has been covered by all of these wonderful points. I mean, yeah, a lot of it has already been said. To me, poetry can be anything. It's not necessarily just a poem. It could be someone who's upset, who's yelling at Walmart. It could be a commercial jingle on the TV. It could be a formal poem. It could be someone blabbing. To me, poetry is whatever sticks in the memory. So there's a certain emotion and rhythm to it, that when the emotions are heightened, this sort of like form comes out, some iambic form with like a certain timbre to the voice. So to me, like poetry would be emotion, because like all this stuff had to, before there were books about poetry, we must have been doing something that somebody saw it and said, oh, I'm going to record that, whatever he did. So it came from us first, it came from the body first, before the brain noticed it and compartmentalized it and then named it. So to me, it's like poetry is, as someone said earlier on, sorry, I forgot who exactly said it, but how to me it's oral first, right? I mean, imagine asking someone to marry them, but you like said, hey, and you gave them an envelope and then you ran away like a little bitch and they read them, but you got to get down on your knees and look at them. To me, poetry is before you even say anything, that you're already in a state of poetry. So that to me is like, is that, I mean, I want to give, the next person and other people a chance to speak. I'll just say like one example that I will always remember of poetry was me and my friends were hanging out in the park and just smoking joints and freestyle rapping, right, off the top of our head. And then my friend's cell phone rang and he said, oh, shh, oh, it's my mom. She's calling me from like up north. We all have to behave. And I was like, no, we're not going to behave. You're going to tell your mom to rap. And he thought I was crazy. And I was like, no, you're going to do it. Trust me. Just get her on the phone, tell her what we're doing. And she's going to, and just tell her what we're doing and tell her that it's her turn. So I don't know why he listened to me. Wasn't even being serious, but he did. And he told her, what we were doing. And then he's like, it's your turn. And she was driving this pickup truck and she just started rapping off the top of her head. And it was good. And it was emotional, like she was going into it. And it's just like, poetry is a very simple thing at the end of the day. I think anyone can do it. I think it should be a part of our just like daily lives. You know what I mean? Like we love to go to the bar or the cafe and converse in prose or whatever you want to call it, regular speech. Poetry should be as natural as that. And I think that poetry is also dangerous because when you do allow the rhythm to take over you, you don't know what's going to come out of your mouth, right? It's like kind of like if someone wants to go bungee jumping and he's like, any minute now, I'm ready. And then your friend just pushes you over before you're ready. And then you want to kill him, but you're already going down. That's what like it feels like, because the rhythm is pushing you forward. And we're afraid of these ideas and thoughts and rhythms coming out of us. We're afraid we're going to say something that we're trying to bury and squelch, but the rhythm just kind of like pushes the words out of you before you have a chance to get them back. So like poetry excavates the truth in that way, in a very blunt, brutal way. You know what I mean? And then, I mean, of course, whole other philosophical conversation for another day in terms of like poetic forms that exist. It's like, oh, I don't know what to do. It's like, okay, well, you know what? Here's a sonnet. You don't have to think. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Do some sonnets. Just like all the work has been done for you. You just get to plug the coordinates in. You know what I mean? So the burden is off. And then once you get sick of those sonnets, which you invariably will, because obviously our expression will want to seek different nuances of how, we feel in that particular moment. But it's like good training wheels. You know what I mean? And a lot of people made a lot of money back in the day, like mastering a certain poetic form. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cam. I really like this concept. This question that you put forth, saying that what is poetry? Poetry is actually much larger concept than what people think it is. And what I want to do is I want to invite everybody, after Katie, I want to invite everybody to talk about this. So let me just talk a little bit about it. So Owen Barfield has a very good way of thinking about it. is that I really like how he thinks about it. He's written a book called Poetic Diction. It's a tremendous influence on, he's a good friend of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And he talks about, he says that poetry or language has the potential, has the power of producing felt change of consciousness. So it's like something which is poetic. What it does is that it really shakes you up and you see something new that you have not seen before. You see, you experience it. It's an aesthetic experience. And at the same time, it's a conscious, it's a like conscious experience, aesthetic experience, all in one. It's a very delicate thing. It's a living thing. Okay, I mean, the best way to think of it is like, the way in which I think about it is, it's a living thing. And you see life and you respond to life directly and you sing with it. And so it's not just passive. The simplest way to actually, that I found for pretty much every art, is to always take the position of creator of art, not just a consumer of art. Only if you want, even if you just wanted to consume art, you should start creating art, because that actually shows you the shape of it, shows you the, gives you the appreciation of it. Art is for production. And what it does for you, like singing, for example, which is, I like singing as art, because different arts speak more to you than others. Like for some, visual arts really touch you. For some, it's music. For some, it's words. So whichever art you choose, and there is poetry in each of them. There is a poetry in movement. There is poetry in music. There is poetry in words. So I really like this question of saying, what is poetry? When do you say that there is poetry in something? When do you have that experience? We can go ahead. Go ahead, Cam.
Really quickly, yeah, because I don't want to blab, and I have a tendency to blab. I just want to potentially challenge you just on the consciousness thing too. I mean, most of the, like 99% of the time, absolutely, you're right. There is like a conscious component. The great poets have something to say about the world, and there's like content, right? There's content and form. But when I think about, like, when people sing a song that they remember from their childhood, and they hear it later and they realize, oh, I didn't know the words. I got the words wrong. Or, especially if you grew up on hip hop, and it's just like half of those words, like when I was a kid, I didn't even know what they mean. So what content was I responding to? I think that I was purely responding to tone of voice, vowel and consonant and rhythm, ultimately. And that vibe or attitude, I guess you could say, like so I don't know that, like, what the conscious component I would be responding to. And in other cases, sometimes the content is actively vile. You know what I mean? It's a consciousness that you don't even want to interact with, but the what I'm going to call poetry, the poetry pulls you in. So if I think about slurs, right? Slurs of all stripes, these words that are intended to hurt, like, obviously, but we have to ask ourselves, why do they have legs? Why do these words continue on generation after generation, even though they shouldn't be around anymore? They're like roaches. You can't get rid of them. You know what I mean? You stamp them out, and then the brothers and sisters come out the next day. It's just like, I think because there's someone, like, mentioned the gift of the gab earlier on, or like a ring to it. So again, when we go back to so those vile words are keeping themselves alive purely by their shape and timbre and texture. So we can't even stamp them out, even if we wanted to. And I believe that on a subconscious level, bit of a controversy, I'm going out on a limb here, maybe we don't even want to kill those words, because poetry is irresistible. And it's just certain words are like the crazy drunk uncle that you don't really want to pull him out at the party, but you don't want him to die. You know what I mean? It's just like, okay, Uncle Jeff we're just going to pretend he's not talking right now. We'll let him spout off at the dinner table. But it's just like, so words keep themselves alive by their form. So I am very much, again, to quote one of you guys at the beginning, style over substance guy. Substance is so important, but if you don't have the style gets people into the door, right? And then once you're in the living room, they're like those salesmen. Once they're in your living room, then they can sit down and use deductive reasoning to sell you their product. But if they don't get you right when you like open that door and they go into whatever spiel they go into, if they don't have poetry, they don't get into the house. So that's how I feel about that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cam. Next up is Katie.
I just was enjoying when Paul was talking about how he went to sleep and then he like looked at it again. I remember in college, that's what a professor said, was to look at writing a different day, because then you're more likely to see it like someone else would rereading it. I mean, it's hard to be objective, but especially if you, and especially like I read a story recently about something I wrote 10 years ago, and I was like, wow, that I picked up on things in it. And then secondly, so what I would do is I would write down all my points, and then I would try to, embellish it and make it sound like how I want it to sound. And then I would step away, do something totally different, and then come back to it. I think I had a friend in school, and she tended to outline. We were talking about like structure, like how much do you plan? She tended to outline. I probably couldn't do that myself. I think I would kind of like want to be more creative and free form, and then maybe even potentially go back and then say, did I hit all the points I want to make, or could I organize my points better, and then step away and then come back. But I think everybody's a little bit different. My friend would have gone a different way. She's always like, here's an outline. This, hit this point here, hit this point here, hit this point here. This is all the territory I want to cover. And that my brain doesn't work like that. I would want this very like, this is what I want to say. This is what I want to say, like beautiful. And then I'm like, well, maybe that paragraph would have gone better before that one. And then I move things around. So.
Yeah. Again, I'm talking about my friend Rob, because I really learned this idea of kind of this shuttling from him. But the most profound advice that I've ever heard from him is what he tells his writing students. He says, if you want to write, write. Because a lot of it actually comes from you engaging yourself. You writing poetry, you singing, you drawing. And in that, now, of course, you surround yourself with people who are doing it to an amazing level, but you keep doing that. And it is that your commitment to your own skill, your own commitment to your own expression is what really will, takes you forward. Next up is going to be Paul. Folks, if anybody else wants to talk about poetry at this point, even if you don't write poetry, if you'd just like to talk about poetry, what is it that is poetic to you? You're welcome to type ! Paul.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to some of the interesting things Katie said. That reminds me of another aspect of my creative process, which is when Katie talked about an outline, it reminded me of the story poem. And William Blake did it, the poem that actually is telling a story. And you could outline the story, but I am incapable of doing that unless I myself don't know the ending. If I myself know the ending, I'm not going to shuttle well, and I'm going to be way too analytic about telling the story. It's just sort of a creative trick, like I just a way, like I just have to go. I'm learning the story as I write it, or else I just can't do stories otherwise, which is interesting. And the second quick thing is that shuttling, Shrikant. I'm curious if your friend and you talked about what McGilchrist talks about, which is it's always happening. It's happening in milliseconds. With every line we create, the brain, the corpus callosum, it's drawing from the language side, it's so it's constant. It's a constant interplay. I think you're talking about this sort of slow it down and change the dominance for a while and put more focus on one side. But really, we're doing what you're talking about 24/7. And so that's how I can do it without making a big conscious shift. So now I'm going to analyze, I guess if you're trying to correct all your typos and make sure your punctuation's in the right place, you're stuck. You really have to shuttle, but all right. That's the
Yes,
thought.
yes, absolutely. I mean, it depends on what your context is and what you're trying to do. Absolutely. Thank you. So let's see, next up is, okay, wait a minute. DLJ had something to say. DLJ, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I was going to put this out as a question, really, about for those who write. Do you write with ambiguity deliberately, or not, or both? And there's the difference between deliberate ambiguity and accidental. So just an example here, I had to miss a week. So I wrote something, did my homework on stages of life, which Maritza thought was quite good. So she read it out and I had to wait till it was published online before I got to hear what she read. And she had put nuance or subtlety into some of the words. Well, I think she pronounced present as present or vice versa, I can't remember. And I thought, oh, that's better. So that was the non-deliberate ambiguity. But sometimes I'm writing because I want the other person to actually interpret it the way they want to interpret it, right? So I'm writing for an audience, but it's a blank canvas kind of audience, right? Except for the ending, and this is where I completely messed it up because I didn't want ambiguity at the end. And Maritza found a different meaning, and I thought, I know. So it was supposed to be that the girl at the end of the poem was pregnant, so it was a new stage of life starting again, but she read it as the inner life of your soul, because I said about the life within. I thought, oh no, I messed that up, right? So it's about ambiguity, deliberate or not deliberate. And when you was picking up Paul's comment, right, because you said about writing for an audience or not, right? So do you allow for ambiguity, or do you try and keep it to the point where this is the message I want to get across, and there is no, I don't want any nuanced interpretation in this. So I just wanted to know how you guys write for that, an audience, allowing for things like that. Right?
Wonderful. We'll come to that. Let's have Joe and Mushki next. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually really interesting, actually, what DLJ just said. Because recently, actually, I heard somebody say, never tell anybody what you mean by your metaphor, and never ask what they mean by their metaphor, so that you can interpret it, and the unconscious could just come out organically, and people can arrive at their own conclusions. But Paul kind of took exactly what I was trying to say. I was going to say prior to poetry's capture a story. And it communicates a story very, very clearly to me. I mean, sometimes I do think that there's a change of consciousness in certain cases, or actually almost in all cases to a certain degree. I think that there, especially like if you think about poems like the Inferno or the Commedia, that changes the consciousness. It makes people aware of vivid images of what is meant by hell and heaven and things along those lines that they would have never otherwise have had, or any of the great poets, Milton or Virgil, all of these poets, they have a way of actually reaching and communicating a message that storytellers or novelists don't. So for me, that's one of the main things for me. And the other is that it captures, and everybody said this in a way, it captures emotion, an emotional state with a certain rhythm, so that, and I guess DLJ mentioned this, is this idea that he can bring a tear to someone's eye, that they're revealing themselves to them. And he can capture that in words, in a rhythm that can invoke some kind of emotion. It's a pretty incredible, well, it's a pretty incredible personal feat, but it's a pretty incredible way of actually going, as well as for just the style, or just for poetry itself, because not all writing does that. So I think that's those are my thoughts. Those are my immediate thoughts anyway about poetry. Yeah.
Well, thank you. The kind of building on what DLG has said. I mean, I've been looking at metaphors, and there is this concept of conceptual blending, where there is a blended product, and you have an abstraction. But the crucial thing is that you have these two inputs, which are concretes, and you're trying to blend. Create a blend out of that. And what it does is that, like, each of the concretes is complex, and the kind of blend that you end up producing depends on many choices, subconscious and conscious, that you make. So it is really very interesting play how these metaphors work in the brain, because you are suggesting something, and you can you can actually, I mean, it's really fascinating to see how these metaphors work. Some of them are these large schemas where you have so many points mapped out that it's kind of guiding you in a very definite direction. Whereas some things are just like the metaphors that Paul used for love. They are like so different from each other and so unusual that the connections that different people will have for them are going to be very different. And the combination of all of them is going to produce something interesting, and which is going to be very different from person to person. So thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Mushki.
Okay, hi. I'm just sharing for the sake of sharing, but I feel like, most has been said already. What I love about writing poetry is I find it very cathartic. So for me, it's almost like a meditative experience, because I write a lot about my emotions, this type of style. And I often like to write in like a silly, playful way, like kind of like Shel Silverstein, but I'm not as talented. But when I do this, it becomes very cathartic, because I'm taking these painful, heavy emotions and I'm playing with it. I'm instead of just one way of catharsis is just journaling my emotions, but then there's all the seriousness, all the pain comes out. When I write in a poetic way, it's playful, it's fun, and then I got things to focus on. I got the rhythm, there's a certain rhyming scheme I might want to do, or certain rhythm, and so that keeps me away also from like the pain of the emotion I'm describing, and I can still convey the pain without actually experiencing that pain to the point where it's overwhelming. It's like I'm getting it out there. And then another point I want to mention is like also, so that this concept, but like in a group setting, when we did poetry collaboratively, it was very nice, because I really felt like I was in a group therapy session with a very positive like note to it. It's like not focused on negativity. And it was also fun. We had one time where we spoke about different emotions, like sadness, joy, and then there was one about redemption. And this was all just very cathartic, group catharsis, which is in a way even more powerful to get that validation and feedback. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mushki. I mean, this phenomenon of catharsis, that's really fascinating. But what I want to do now is I want to see if anybody else has questions that you want to, catharsis versus vulnerability. That's a great point. So there is just so much to talk about, but here we are, people who've been writing poetry, who've been working with poetry. If you have, like DLG did, if you have any questions that you would like to put on the table, even if you don't write poetry, if you're curious about the process of writing poetry, just go ahead and put the questions, and then anybody who wants to answer it, let's go ahead. You can just type exclamation mark to put a question on the table. Let's take a few questions, and then anybody who wants to answer them can answer them. So I want to, we already have a question on ambiguity, but would love to hear more questions because I like questions better than answers. So let's start with Anton.
Yeah, so a question that I have, I mean, I guess because of who posted it in the chat, I was wondering what she had to say about it, but I guess really it could apply to anyone. That could make it more interesting is, what is the difference between catharsis and vulnerability? That's quite interesting to me. Yeah, so I wonder what anyone has to say about that.
You know what? That's a fantastic question. So let's put that on the table. What is vulnerability? And what is catharsis? And is there a connection between them? What do you guys think? If you'd like to answer it, go ahead and type exclamation mark. So I'll start by talking about vulnerability. I mean, that's a very big concept for me, because it's like, to me, that's like the start of growth. Because if it's basically being open to being wrong, being open to be seen as a fool, not really caring, kind of being okay with all of that. It is about admitting your limitations, admitting your faults, just facing just basic honesty, very deep honesty. And so for me, that is a big concept. So that's what I would say about vulnerability. Next, so you can talk about either vulnerability or catharsis or connection between them. So it's going to be Joe followed by Katie. Joe.
Yeah, I was going to talk about vulnerability as well, because I think it is about being open and essentially open to the truth. And so that I think that's essentially what when you're making yourself vulnerable, you're exposing yourself. And what happens is then you take that, and then you take that as a challenge to wherever your shortcomings or wherever your strengths are. And I think poets often can capture their vulnerability, very, very well, especially like Emily Dickinson in particular. And I think that, yeah, being open to, kind of exposing yourself is some of the most beautiful poetry, ends up in the most beautiful poetry. But you have to be very, very honest about what your fears are. Your fears, it could be of death, I mean, at a very deep level, but it could be of, it can be of other things as well. Fear of where society's going, things like that. So I think vulnerability is long, because there's a degree of authenticity that exists in vulnerability. And I think that helps with writing and actually your own personal growth.
Wonderful. Thank you. Joe, I want to connect it up with two things that we have studied. The first one is Julian Jaynes. So Julian Jaynes actually says that when you're actually listening to somebody, you're giving them a space in your mental space. So if you're actually trying to listen to somebody, you're saying that for a moment, I am going to really follow what they're saying. So you're ceding the control of your head for them for that moment to actually consider what they are saying in the way in which they are thinking. This is going to be another really deep idea on this is that of Carl Rogers, that of authentic relating. Because when you are actually authentically relating to somebody, you are actually open to them. And that is vulnerability. And that is the source of just really tremendous amount of benefit for both parties. So again, I want to make the point that vulnerability in interaction, it really becomes, it is just a win-win. It's a win-win thing at its best. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Cam. Cam.
Yeah, vulnerability can also be strong too, because I feel like words have associations with them. And when I picture vulnerability, I almost picture someone like with their shoulders drawn in a little bit, like they're gonna say something, but they're trepidatious about what they're gonna say, and there's almost like a low status about it in the moment of being vulnerable. But to me, some of the greatest verse are characters, speaking truth to power. Like you take Isabella's speeches from Measure for Measure, where she's this helpless little nun, and the head of state is this guy who's pious on the outside, but a total predator on the inside. And he's basically like, either sleep with me or your brother's gonna die. Have fun mulling that one over. And then she, has these monologues, but then she eventually confronts him. And there's many. So there's like, to me, that is also a sense of vulnerability. You know what I mean? I guess William Wallace getting his limbs pulled off, you know what I mean? And they're like, hey, cry uncle. And he's like, no, you pull my limbs off and I'm going to die, but I'm not going to say that, I don't remember what the words were from the movie, but, so, yeah, like, I think it's a big question. I'm not smart enough to answer that one, catharsis versus vulnerability, because I think that there is a kind of release of emotion in order to be vulnerable. So, I mean, that's one for the philosophers, but yeah, I just wanted to chip that in.
Thank you, Cam. Does anybody want to talk about catharsis? I don't know it very well. It's not something that I focus on much, but I don't know much about it. Next up is Paul. Paul, you're on mute.
Unmute.
Yes.
Okay. So that word is, to me, the way that I relate the two is being vulnerable with another person or a group of people can lead to catharsis in the way that you talked about, the Carl Rogers kind of way, like the person is finally able to do what we talked about of showing their inner world without fear. And that's cathartic, that we just spent the whole night talking about. It's cathartic to hear it and it's cathartic to do it. But there's some qualifiers there. For one, if you just explode your what you consider, that's the next point, your weak spots just anywhere and any time, it's not necessarily going to be cathartic. So it has to be in an environment where that's set up, or it's a safe place, essentially. But the other thing is, I think, I don't know if this is relevant to tonight or not, but, and thank you, Mushki, for talking about catharsis and your experiences in writing. And so someone like Mushki has places that she's vulnerable and she's able to express them through poetry, and it's cathartic. There's people that go into public places and look like they're being vulnerable, but they're really not. And what I mean by that is the definition of vulnerable is a place that's really, you feel you have to protect, that is hard for you. There's a button that's pressed. It's because of a history or some threat system that gets triggered. But some people can talk about very intimate things, but there's no threat system that's triggered. There's nothing. And they look so vulnerable, but that's not vulnerability. I just wanted to make that distinction. So that's what I have to say.
Great distinction. So thank you, Paul. Next up is Anton.
Yeah, or to one of the things that Paul said, I've thought about this before. Something that could be easier for me to say that's not vulnerable for me could be vulnerable for another person or for other people. I mean, that ties in, of course, with what we consider private, but so from that perspective, like what's vulnerable does depend on who's sharing it. I mean, there's one angle I could think of approaching that, but yeah, there's authenticity there, like what Joe was saying. But I think I might have realized the difference, at least in my own mind, between catharsis and vulnerability as I'm listening. I know that wasn't the focus. I know people mostly have talked about what vulnerability is, but I realized with some of what was said about catharsis versus vulnerability so far, that to me, catharsis is, I don't know if this is actually the dictionary definition, but this is my assumption, is like an excess of emotion or an excess of, an excess of emotion. And even though, as I say that, I realize, well, in a way, who decides what's excessive? Like what is excessive? It's the difference between that and, at least I can relate to this in my own writing process, writing something that's difficult for me to share. And I'm especially more conscious of it since I've decided to, I used to post my writing online years ago. And then now recently I've been sharing in meetup groups, my writing. So, but every time it's something public or more public, ties in with something Paul said earlier, I'm more conscious of, at least speculation in my mind, how it will be received or how it could be received. So I'm more conscious of writing something that's difficult for me to write there. And simply because you write something that's difficult about yourself or you perceive as weakness or whatever is vulnerability, but it's not always catharsis. I don't know whether or not I've explained that clearly, but that's kind of my hunch, if nothing else, of what the difference between the two of them are. So yeah, those are some thoughts I have.
Thank you. Again, I'm struggling with this, so I'm going to try. So catharsis, as best as I understand it, it's a release. It's a release of emotion, of something that you're kind of holding inside, which is holding you back, and you release it through whatever means, an expression, writing, speaking to another person. So because you were holding it back, it was occupying your mind, it was limiting you in some way, and the release frees you from that obstruction. So it is focused on, I think release is the big concept that I see in catharsis. But I would love to hear what everybody else has. So it's going to be Cam, Paul, DLJ, and Mike. Cam.
Yeah, I think that was a good lead in to, let's say, the poetry of Ezra Pound, right? When we're talking about the dichotomy of catharsis and vulnerability. Because I don't know when I read his poetry that there is like a release of emotion there. But I would say that there's certainly some vulnerability there. I mean, to be reacting against a tradition in which, meter is very important and adjectives are very important, and all the romantics with their flowery language, people just assume that that's what poetry was, whatever the romantics were doing at the time. And for this guy to try to pay his bills and start a magazine writing essentially 2 lines of non-rhyming, it doesn't even look like verse. But there is a kind of like, for him, that's what it was. That's what poetry was to him. And he was unabashedly showing you his vision of what poetry was. And so to me, that is another type of vulnerability, to just be what you are and to potentially like rebel against the prevailing thing at whatever cost to you. And maybe, maybe they were cathartic for him when he wrote them. So they may not appear so to me, like if I'm reading them, but he's just capturing a moment in time. I might as well tell Monet that Monet's not feeling anything when he just paints, a bunch of flowers with this very fuzzy, soft texture, and that's how he feels about flowers. I could just, accuse the Impressionists of just essentially playing with style and form and not really pouring themselves out. But how do I know that? So, I don't even know the answer to that question is, but I think that he would make a good case study for that question that Katie posed.
Thank you. Thank you, Cam. Next up is going to be Paul, followed by DLJ. Paul.
Yeah, I didn't contribute my thoughts on definition of catharsis, so I'll try real quickly, which is, so I think it's broader than what Tomo said. Thanks for all your comments tonight, Cam, by the way. It's great to have a new person talking to us, and thanks, and everyone here. Great discussion. So quick, to me, catharsis could be a pianist playing a Brahms piano concerto. It could be jumping out of a plane. It could be a really deep conversation with a friend where you admit or say or exchange new information. Those are all could be cathartic by my definition, which means I'm viewing it, I'm learning how I view it as a transcendence of a pain state. How's that?
A
So
transcendence
it's related to
of-
vulnerability because there's some kind of pain state and you somehow escape it, you transcend it.
Mhm.
That's my thought.
Very nice. Very nice. Thank you. Next up is DLJ.
Yeah, so just on vulnerability versus catharsis, yeah. Yeah, not the same. Vulnerability, you're exposing, open was a word used in the chat, exposing something. Catharsis doesn't have to be that. Catharsis is, if you want a visual image, think vomit. So you're getting some poison out sometimes. It doesn't have to be anything vulnerable. It could be just, and if you're lucky, the splatter pattern that you make with your vomit is pretty. Not often, but it can be, right? So if you want to understand catharsis, it's getting it out, right? It's like what is inside getting it. That could be anger, right? And that could be, there's nothing vulnerable. I mean, somebody could interpret that as your vulnerability, right? But it's not quite the same as when you open yourself up and say, take a hit, right? Which is essentially what vulnerability is. So I think they can overlap, yeah, but they are very different, I think. And I think quite a lot of us, I get the impression originally when we start writing it, it's probably a bit of catharsis is where we probably start, right? And it takes a while before we want to share our vulnerability. Is that true, gentlemen and ladies?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, DLJ. Next up is Mike, followed by Mushki. Mike, what do you think about this?
Well, it comes from the Greek word used for purification. Socrates' trial was cathartic both to him when he drank the hemlock, and cathartic for the Greek populace by getting rid of, as DLJ said, vomiting out the evils of Socrates that he was supposedly doing to purge, to corrupt Greek youth. Hippocrates used that term again. If you eat the poison mushrooms, inducing vomiting was cathartic. It means purification. It was not only done for yourself, it was done with words and plays for others, and was involuntarily done to criminals to get rid of the evil spirits from within them involuntarily and painfully. So it's essentially a purification. It has medical connection, it has psychological connection, it has a St. Augustine connection, and it basically involves cleansing both society and yourself. I first heard the term in reading about the trial of Spinoza, which led me to the trial of Socrates, which led me to 52 Living Ideas, and here I am.
Thank you.
I am now cathartically relieved of my words.
Thank you, Mike. That was actually very concise and organized, cathartic speech.
Thank you. I'm trying to be brief since you.
Yes, I am very impressed. I am very impressed. That was, yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Mushki.
So it's so funny. So Mike made me laugh because actually he took out some of the things he was mentioning philosophers. So I decided to do a Google entry just now about catharsis because I thought Freud came up with it, with his idea of talk therapy, which he later contradicted in himself. But anyway, turns out Aristotle came up with it. It was his like a theory of theater. He says that when people watch tragedy, they actually gain catharsis from it. It makes them feel their own like inner tragedy and experience catharsis from it. And so it's interesting. Mike also touched, and also someone mentioned vomit. So catharsis has two meanings. Like Mike said, purification, but it also is Greek for purgitation. So that's it. All right.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mushki. Next up is Cam.
Yeah, catharsis is a purification. But again, like word association, when I think about purify, I think about clean water, and there's like these sort of positive connotations to it. For Oedipus, purification was stabbing his own eyes out when he found out the truth about who he was and what he'd done and why Thebes was all sick. So, I mean, like, how many of us, I mean, anyone, have the like wherewithal to say, you know, I'm going to spend the rest of my life looking inward to find out, to sort through my own muck. And obviously, like, we're not going to go to those theatrical extremes. It's just a symbol, but whatever that means in tangible, practical terms, to commit to, you know, that purification. What sort of things are we willing to go through? You know, because there's the audience's catharsis. They watch it from the safe distance that we watch art. And then when the show is over, they cry some tears and they think about their lives, but they're intact. For the characters who make that sacrifice for us, you know, like, you know, so in our real lives, we actually can perform actions to purify ourselves. And the question is, you know, like, what lengths are we willing to go through to do that? And it's not easy, you know. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Cam. Folks, this has been an amazing, amazing conversation. We are almost coming to 11 o'clock. Firstly, I want to thank Marisa for hosting, you know, and just doing such a wonderful job with this series. It's always, you know, I try to attend whenever I can. But you know, for 52 Living Ideas, I think this has been really something special, because I don't know, like, firstly, the idea of collaborative poetry, which we did not do today, that is very, very powerful, I think. I'm always stunned to see what ends up with it. But I think what we have, you know, what Maritza has managed to do is to develop this, you know, community here of people who are so deeply engaged with poetry and the love of words and love of expression. And it is being done in such a, what shall I say, such a positive context that everybody is putting their thoughts out and going back and forth on all of it. So it's just wonderful. So I'm really honored to have all of you folks here. So thank you very much. We have got many meetups coming up. So we are wrapping up our Bhagavad-Gita meetup. We are doing summary of Bhagavad-Gita now. We spent almost 200 hours going through Bhagavad-Gita. And if you want to just see what the summary is, you can attend the last two meetups, where we are going to be going chapter by chapter. And Yogeshwar, who has been amazingly generous in sharing his deep knowledge of Bhagavad Gita with us. And so many people have gotten so much out of it. So I recommend the last two series, last two ones. This is going to be Thursday and Friday. This Wednesday, we are going to be working on improv. Mike will be back with that, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much, everybody. Just great meetup today. Good night,
Thank you.
everybody. Bye.
Good night.
Hang on.
Yes. Yes, DLG.
Next week, sir. You're Maritza today. Sorry for Cam, who's first time, right? Maritza is usually the lady who hosts this, but now we're putting.
He's much
Shrikant
better
on the
than
spot.
me, by the way, Cam.
We're going to put Shrikant
did
on the spot.
great.
He has to choose the next author. Because I did my homework like a good boy. I've got a heaven and hell and heaven
Okay.
conversation thing. So I'll
All
say
right.
that till next
You
week.
are right. Thank you, DLG, for reminding me. Okay, so I'm taking recommendations for the poet. So what we do, I really like the idea of featured poets, where we get to kind of feel a particular style of poetry. Just even like 5 or 6 poems read by different people, just it shows you. We were talking about style, it's that style becomes apparent. So any thoughts? Does anybody have any recommendations for
Should we ask Cam? Cam's the new boy. Go on, you can have first.
Okay.
Cam,
This is going to sound like I'm being tongue in cheek. Maybe I am, but when I went to university, I have an English literature degree, and it just really saddened me that they never taught any rappers in university. That they didn't teach any Tupac, because a lot of that goes to what I said. That poetry it is about the words, it is about the content, but there's a spirit behind it. And Tupac was not the greatest lyricist. He was not even in the top 10, but he was the greatest rapper of all time because there was a spirit that emanated from his verse. So obviously, I'm not saying that let's bring in like hip hop to study his poetry. I would love that, but I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that I'm just putting this out to the universe. I would hope that one day they will teach all poets in our educational institutions, and that the great Shakespeare, when he wrote his plays, he had to satisfy the groundlings, and he had to satisfy the queen, and he had to satisfy the whole community with that one play. So he wrote the high, he wrote the low, he wrote the middle, and I would hope that we regard all of our poets in the same light. So I don't have any recommendations. I just wanted to sneak in a little soapbox speech. I needed to get that off my
I
chest.
think you got Anton's vote with that one. Nodding away.
Well,
Yeah.
Thank you, Cam. Let's see what other recommendations people have. So I'm going to just collect the recommendations and give them to Maritza, and Maritza makes the final decision here. She has a whole stable of poets that she likes, so there's no dearth. Next up is Joe. Joe, what do you think?
I was gonna just and nobody's gonna want to go with this, so I'm just gonna say Robert Frost, because it's so boring. I know that as
Okay,
a
I
selection.
will pass.
I would love
along-
Robert Frost. I would love Robert Frost. You have my vote for that.
Okay. I was thinking. I thought Fire and Ice right away, and that's so something like that, the heaven and hell kind of thing.
Paul.
I'm going to selfishly suggest H.P. Lovecraft.
Okay. Okay,
Because
Great.
very interesting, and it's Halloween,
Okay.
so Maritza can consider that.
Wonderful. So I'll pass this on to Maritza, and we'll pick something. And I don't know if heaven and hell will continue to exist by next Monday. If still around, then we will go ahead with that as a theme that was supposed to be the collaborative poetry theme. So, and DLJ has prepared for it, so I don't know
Yeah.
how to disappoint him.
It's
Next
not
is
good.
Anton.
I won't give a solid recommendation for who. I will say, I think it was actually just earlier today, going along with Cam's comments, because obviously it's no surprise based on what I said earlier that the idea of people talking about hip hop poetry is great to me. But I was thinking earlier today about Tupac or whatever, like what is the, because like along the lines of what Cam was saying, there's and like I'm trying to think about how to put this into words. Like I know his storytelling and how reflective he is, I think are two aspects of him that people really care about. Even though there are a certain amount of people that I know of who are more lyrical, as in they, you know, their rhymes are more intricate or whatever. So I was thinking about the appeal of why he appeals to me and why he appeals to other people. So just wanted to throw that in there. Because
You know what, if you guys don't mind, let me ask you this as a question, because it's a relatively new art form. So what makes hip hop unique in your mind? What is it that hip hop does? What is its unique?
You have to be standing up to do it.
Yes.
That if I have any sort of like, if there's any common denominator to all of my comments, just like the way that I view this stuff, is that language and poetry comes from the body.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So like it just from the toes and from the spine and from the viscera and from the tongue and soft palate and lips and jaw and whatever muscles are behind your eyebrows, like to me it's a cellular thing. So, you know, hip hop was basically, I'm not a historian, but it was born on the streets of people competing with words. I don't know what they were competing for, whether it was for money, but like way back in the jazz, the turn of the 20th century, on the streets. I don't know my history too well, but you know, and Shakespeare was an actor. So a lot of these poets, it's just their poetry was physical. So, I mean, like I have a bias towards that. Now, obviously, can someone sit down and architect a gorgeous poem? Absolutely. I mean, I friggin' like memorized The Wasteland or the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. I mean, I love Eliot's poetry. So it can come from anywhere. But I just think that in this day and age, you know, like, yeah, anyway.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Cam. Actually, this connection of body is very interesting. That's one of the things I'm looking at. There is this book that we are looking at. It's called Clear and Simple as the Truth. There is the author of that. I think, I forget his name, Mark Tucker, I think. He's written a book on embodied concepts. I mean, his whole point is that all our concepts, all our abstractions are actually rooted in our body, are based on our body, and they are ways of seeing patterns of our body. And the Western mind, especially since Descartes, Plato did it too, separated these two things, abstractions and concretes, matter and spirit, and they were considered as separate. Whereas actually the conceptual arises from the perceptual. The most of the deepest of ideas, you know, come and are rooted in, are based in. And when you are actually communicating, and that's why, for example, oral communication is so much more powerful, because you're actually seeing the other body in action, which you're not when it is written. So it is a very, very deep point. And
let's not forget, Plato wrote the Symposium too, right? Which is really about like an older dude thinks the younger dude is kind of hot, and you know, let's all sit around and have philosophical conversations, but really he's just trying to get into the guy's pants, right? So I mean, Plato was like, he understood his Dionysian he understood the Dionysian component of his soul as well. He wasn't just like when one of those guys writes a poem or an essay that makes people quit smoking, then I'll believe in the power of the word. You know, until then, it's all a mystery to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. It is Mark Turner who's written this book on kind of on this series of books, as well as I think Mark Johnson, who is the co-author of George Lakoff. who talks about the body and conceptions, if you want to look them up. Anton, do you have any thoughts about, what is unique about the hip hop?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, especially if I talk about it as a genre, and the way that it has, I mean, it's very different. The way that it sounds today is very different than its origin. And there's certain things within that I do enjoy. And also I just like the idea of art evolving over time anyway. But I think, it's like my dad is a former pianist, like jazz musician. And he expressed to me, despite the fact that he has a very different view of hip hop than what I do, he was like, well, hip hop came from jazz. And he's like, go to this presentation at this library and learn about, jazz. And that helped me to get an appreciation for how, but it's an interesting evolution. It's not, I would say, I'm not saying other people would say, but this is one way in which hip hop is unique. I'll just keep it like as concise as I can. And that I wouldn't expect hip hop to come from jazz. Logically, I wouldn't expect that to happen. Obviously, it appeals to me that it has. But another thing, and this really influences my writing, I didn't always appreciate this with writing, but it's actually more in recent years as I've listened to more lyrical, I use the word rappers, but when they're more lyrical, the word MCs can be preferred by them or by certain people in the hip hop community. The fact that you can write these I mean, I'm not saying this is only in hip hop, but people who are especially good at double entendres, and especially if you have a triple entendre, like, wow, that's one of the most amazing aspects to me of somebody who is, especially, it doesn't have to be to this degree, but a master of lyricism. Like, I look at that and I'm like, wow, imagine being that good with words or that good with constructing writing or freestyling. So those are some thoughts that I have.
Thank you, Anton. Next up is going to be Paul.
Yeah, if I had to justify your dad's comment, I'd say he's right in the sense that the jazz came from the blues, and the blues were the talking blues. If you want to get to heaven, got to tell you what to do. You got to grease your feet in a little mutton stew. You just slide out of the devil's hand and you ooze on over to the promised land. That's the origin of it, in my opinion, the talking blues. Mm-hmm. And that was also a source of where jazz evolved from. Anyway, quick thought on that.
Wonderful, wonderful. On that note, good night, everybody. Bye.